My sister jokingly spilled wine on my $6,800 suit right before her engagement photos. Because I never lent her money for her luxury vacations, she laughed. Relax, it's just a suit. Mom shrugged. Don't ruin the mood. I said nothing. The next morning, at 7 a.m., she got a notification. Her job offer had been revoked. Turns out, her new boss is my future brother-in-law. I, 32M, stood there in the middle of my parents' living room, watching deep red wine seep into the Italian wool of my Tom Ford suit. The fabric darkened as the liquid spread across my chest and down my legs. My sister was laughing. Not a polite chuckle or an embarrassed giggle, but full-throated laughter that filled the entire room. She told me to relax, that it was just a suit, her voice dripping with the same dismissiveness she'd shown me for years. This was about the money, she said between laughs. About all those times I refused to fund her luxury trips to Bali, to the Maldives, to wherever influencers were posting their champagne breakfasts that month. She'd asked me at least a dozen times over the past 3 years. Each time I explained that I was saving for my business, that I'd worked 80-hour weeks to afford the things I had, that her vacation emergencies weren't my responsibility. Each time she'd rolled her eyes and called me selfish. Mom stood behind her, arms crossed, telling me not to ruin the mood. The photographer was setting up in the garden. The engagement party was in 3 hours. Guests were already on their way. This wasn't the time for drama, she said. My sister needed these photos to be perfect. Couldn't I just change and move on? I looked down at the suit. I'd bought it for a pitch meeting that landed me my biggest client. I'd worn it to sign the partnership agreement that doubled my company's revenue. It wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol of every sacrifice I'd made while my sister partied through her 20s on our parents' dime, then mine when theirs ran out. I didn't say anything. I walked upstairs to my old bedroom, peeled off the ruined suit, and changed into jeans and a plain shirt. Through the window, I could see my sister posing with her fiancé in the garden, her white engagement dress catching the afternoon light. The photographer was already snapping away. Everything was perfect for her. I came back downstairs and told my parents I was leaving. Mom protested, said I was being petty, that family was supposed to support each other. Dad barely looked up from his phone. My sister didn't even turn around. I drove home thinking about her fiancé. We'd only met twice. Once at a family dinner where he talked mostly about his new position as regional director at some tech consulting firm. Once at a barbecue where he'd spend an hour on a work call. He seemed decent enough, if a bit corporate. But I didn't really know him, and I didn't care to. What I did know was that my sister had just landed her dream job. She'd been going on about it for weeks. A marketing director position at a mid-size firm, significant pay bump, full benefits, the works. She was supposed to start in 2 weeks. She'd already quit her current job, already signed a lease on a new apartment closer to the office. This was her big break, she kept saying. Her chance to finally build something real. That evening, I sat in my home office and opened my laptop. I ran a small but successful management consulting firm. Nothing massive, but we'd built a reputation for helping companies optimize their leadership structures. One of our longtime clients was a tech consulting company that had recently promoted someone to regional director. I'd worked with their executive team on the transition. I pulled up my email and found the thread. The regional director's name was right there in the CC line. My future brother-in-law. Small world. I spent the next hour thinking. Then I made a phone call. The conversation was professional. I asked him how the transition was going, whether he needed any additional support with his new team. We talked about hiring challenges, about the difficulty of finding candidates who fit the company culture. I mentioned that cultural fit mattered more than credentials sometimes. He agreed completely. Then, almost casually, I mentioned that I'd heard through family connections that they'd recently made an offer to someone in marketing. My sister, actually. Congratulations to both of them. He paused, thanked me, said he was excited to have strong talent joining the team. Then I asked if he knew her well. He said they'd only met a few times, briefly. I told him that made sense, that family dynamics could be complicated. I mentioned that I'd always been impressed by people who took accountability seriously, who understood that actions had consequences. He agreed again. We talked a bit more about leadership philosophy, about integrity, about the kind of people you wanted representing your organization. I didn't lie. I didn't exaggerate. I just told him a story. I told him about growing up with a sister who'd learned that charm could substitute for responsibility. About how our parents had always cleaned up her messes, paid her credit card bills, made excuses for her behavior, about how she'd moved through life expecting others to carry her weight. I told him about the loans she'd never repaid, not just to me, but to friends, former roommates, even ex-boyfriends. I told him about the job she'd been fired from 2 years ago for repeatedly missing deadlines and blaming her team. Our parents had convinced her to leave it off her resume, to call it a mutual departure. I told him about today, about the suit, about the laughter, about the complete absence of remorse. Then I stopped talking and let him think. He asked me if I was certain about the details. I told him I was. He asked if I thought she'd changed. I said I honestly didn't know, but that patterns tended to persist without serious intervention. He thanked me for my candor, said he appreciated the difficult position I was in, that he respected my honesty even when it complicated family matters. We ended the call professionally. I closed my laptop and poured myself a drink. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from my mother. I ignored them and made coffee. By the time I'd finished my first cup, my sister was calling. Then my father. Then my mother again. I let them all go to voicemail. Around 9, my mother showed up at my door. She was furious. She demanded to know what I'd done, what I'd said. My sister's job offer had been revoked. The company had sent an email at 7 that morning citing concerns about cultural fit and organizational alignment. They'd apologized for any inconvenience. My sister was devastated. She'd already quit her old job. She'd signed a lease. She had no income and no prospects. I asked Mom how she knew I had anything to do with it. She said my sister's fiancé had mentioned that I'd called him yesterday, that we'd had a conversation about integrity and accountability. He hadn't explicitly said I was responsible, but the timing was obvious. I told her I'd had a professional conversation with a professional contact. That was all. I didn't tell them to revoke the offer. I didn't demand anything. I simply provided information that I thought was relevant to a hiring decision. She called me vindictive, cruel, said I destroyed my sister's life over a suit. I corrected her. Not over a suit. Over a lifetime of entitlement and disrespect that had finally caught up with her. The suit was just the moment I stopped enabling it. Mom left threatening to cut me off from the family. I told her that was her choice. My sister called an hour later, crying. She begged me to fix this, to call her fiancé, to tell him she'd changed. She promised she'd pay me back for the suit, for the loans, for everything. She swore she'd be different. I asked her if she remembered what she'd said yesterday. If she remembered laughing as she poured wine on something I valued. If she remembered telling me to relax, that it was just a suit. She went quiet. I told her that actions had consequences. That for years, she'd lived in a world where Mom and Dad shielded her from those consequences. Where she could take and never face the bill. That world didn't exist anymore. She started screaming, calling me every name she could think of. Said I was jealous of her engagement, her happiness, her success. Said I was a miserable person who couldn't stand to see her thrive. I hung up. Update 1. 3 days passed. My parents stopped calling. The family group chat, usually buzzing with Mom's forwards and Dad's golf updates, went silent. I assumed I'd been removed. My sister's fiancé called me on Thursday evening. He apologized for the family drama, said he hadn't anticipated the fallout would be this severe. I told him he'd made a business decision based on relevant information. What happened next was between him and my sister. He explained that after our conversation, he'd done additional research. He'd called one of her references, someone who wasn't on her official list, but whose name had come up in conversation. That person had confirmed everything I'd said and added a few stories I didn't even know about. A project she'd abandoned halfway through, leaving her team to cover for her. A client presentation she'd missed because she'd been hungover from a birthday trip. Small things individually, but they painted a picture. He'd brought his concerns to HR. They'd reviewed the background check more carefully and found discrepancies in her employment history. The job she claimed to have left for growth opportunities had actually terminated her contract early. She'd listed responsibilities at her current role that didn't match what her supervisor described. Nothing illegal, but enough red flags that the company decided to withdraw the offer rather than risk a bad hire. He asked me if I felt guilty. I thought about it honestly before answering. I told him I felt sad that it had come to this, but not guilty. Guilty would mean I'd done something wrong. I'd simply told the truth. If the truth cost her the job, maybe the job wasn't built on a solid foundation to begin with. He said he understood, that he actually respected my position, even if it made family dinners awkward for the foreseeable future. Then he told me something interesting. He said my sister had spent the past few days blaming everyone but herself. Blaming me for sabotaging her, blaming him for not defending her, blaming the company for being unreasonable. She hadn't once acknowledged that maybe, possibly, her own actions had played a role. He was starting to see the pattern I described. I asked him if he was reconsidering the engagement. He went quiet for a moment, then said he didn't know yet, that he loved her, but he was seeing sides of her he hadn't noticed before. That stress revealed character, and this stress was revealing things that concerned him. We hung up. I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of grim validation. I hadn't been crazy all these years. The problems I'd seen weren't exaggerations or jealousy. They were real, and now someone else was seeing them too. Update 2. The engagement party happened without me, obviously. I heard about it from a cousin who texted me photos. Small gathering, mostly her friends, noticeably tense according to the gossip. My sister had apparently spent most of it complaining about the job situation to anyone who would listen. Several guests had offered sympathy before she explained what had actually happened. Once people understood that her brother had torpedoed her opportunity over a family dispute, the sympathy evaporated pretty quickly. Except that wasn't quite what happened, and the truth started leaking out. One of her college friends reached out to me on social media. We'd met a few times over the years, seemed like a reasonable person. She said my sister had told everyone I'd maliciously sabotaged her out of spite, that I'd lied to her fiancé about made-up incidents. But this friend had been there for some of those incidents. She'd been the roommate my sister had stiffed on 2 months of rent before moving out unannounced. She'd watched my sister blame a failed group project on everyone else when she'd barely contributed. She wanted me to know that not everyone was buying my sister's version of events. That conversation opened a door I hadn't expected. Over the next week, different people from my sister's past contacted me. An ex-boyfriend she'd cheated on and then claimed had been controlling. A former co-worker who'd been blamed for my sister's mistakes. A friend from high school who'd loaned her money for what was supposed to be an emergency, but turned out to be concert tickets. All of them had been burned. All of them had been painted as the villains in her stories. I started to realize that what I'd thought was a family pattern was actually much larger. My sister hadn't just learned entitlement from our parents. She'd perfected it into an entire life strategy. Take what you want, charm your way through consequences, and when that fails, make yourself the victim. Meanwhile, her job search wasn't going well. She'd applied to a dozen positions, all at her previous level or higher. She was getting interviews, but no offers. I suspected the background checks were catching up with her. In our industry, people talk. Word gets around. Mom called me for the first time since her angry visit. Her tone was different this time, less accusatory, more defeated. She asked me if I was happy now, if I felt like I'd won. I told her this wasn't about winning. It was about my sister finally facing reality. Mom said reality was destroying her, that my sister was depressed, barely leaving her apartment, talking about giving up on her career entirely, that the wedding planning had stopped because she couldn't afford her half of the expenses, that her fiancé was pulling away, canceling dates, spending more time at work. I asked Mom what she expected me to do about it. She said I could call the company, explain that I'd been angry and exaggerated, that I could give my sister a fresh start. I told her no. I hadn't exaggerated anything, and I wasn't going to lie to undo consequences she'd earned. If my sister wanted a fresh start, she needed to create it herself by actually changing. Mom started crying, said I'd turned into someone she didn't recognize, someone cold and vengeful. I told her that was fine, that maybe the person she recognized was just another enabler she'd trained to accept unacceptable behavior. We hadn't spoken since. Update 3. 2 months after the suit incident, my sister's fiancé called off the engagement. He didn't ghost her or create drama. He sat her down and explained that he couldn't marry someone he didn't trust, and he didn't trust her anymore. The job situation had started it, but everything that followed had confirmed his doubts. The lies she'd told about me, about her past, about why she'd really left her previous jobs. The refusal to take any accountability. The expectation that he'd fix everything for her. She was devastated, called me sobbing, begging me to talk to him, to explain that she'd been under stress, that she wasn't normally like this. I told her the truth. She was exactly like this. She'd always been like this. The stress hadn't created a new person. It had just removed the mask from the existing one. She hung up on me. 3 weeks later, she moved back in with our parents. She'd burned through her savings and couldn't afford the new apartment lease she'd signed. Our parents, predictably, welcomed her back and immediately started making excuses. She'd been through trauma, they said. She needed support, not judgment. I wondered if they'd ever realized they were the reason she kept failing. That every time they caught her, they prevented her from learning to catch herself. But that wasn't my problem anymore. My business was thriving. I'd landed 2 new clients in the past month. I'd hired an assistant and was considering expanding the office. The suit I'd worn to those meetings was a replacement for the Tom Ford. Not quite as expensive, but just as sharp. I'd had it cleaned and donated the wine-stained one. No point keeping symbols of toxicity. I ran into my former future brother-in-law at a networking event last week. We talked briefly, professionally. He thanked me again for being honest with him, said it had saved him from a massive mistake. He was dating someone new, someone from outside the family chaos. He seemed genuinely happy. I asked him if he felt guilty about how things had ended with my sister. He thought about it and said no. Guilty would mean he'd done something wrong. He'd simply recognized incompatibility before making a permanent commitment. I smiled at that, told him it was a wise perspective. I haven't spoken to my parents in 6 weeks. The family group chat is still silent. My sister occasionally texts me, usually late at night, usually drunk or emotional. Sometimes apologetic, sometimes angry, always blaming someone else for where she ended up. I don't respond anymore. There's nothing left to say. People ask me sometimes if I regret what I did, if I think I went too far. I tell them I made a phone call and told the truth. Everything that followed was just gravity. My sister had been living at an altitude she hadn't earned, supported by other people's money and patience and excuses. I didn't push her off. I just stopped holding the ladder. She's working retail now, according to family gossip. Something she considers beneath her, naturally. Mom keeps suggesting I could help her get a better job through my connections. I haven't responded to that either. The thing about consequences is that they only work if you let them happen. For 30 years, my family prevented my sister from experiencing consequences. They taught her that actions and outcomes weren't connected, that charm and manipulation could substitute for character and competence. I didn't destroy her life. I just stopped participating in the delusion that she could avoid building one honestly. The suit has been replaced. The business is growing. The family ties are severed, at least for now. I sleep fine at night. Some people call it revenge. I call it accountability. The difference matters, but only if you're willing to see it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot. And if you have any thoughts, questions, or story ideas, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.